tend to work under cover of night. In fact, such actions are almost welcomed, as it is a way of keeping the anti-colonial conversation going, maintaining its profile, ensuring that the discourse remains alive in public consciousness. And of course, the hacked and then unhacked signs can always be rehacked. A hacking fest. A third approach, which bears on the correction of misleading captions on the official street signs, can be illustrated by one of the figures represented here, Lorenzo Giusti, an anarchist and one of the leaders of the Railway Workers' Trade Union, who was hounded by the fascist regime, was forced to relocate to France and Spain, where he fought in the Civil War. Subsequently, he returned to France, where he was confined in a concentration camp. When his liberty was restored, he fought against the Germans and was captured at Dunkirk, deported to Germany. He again escaped, moved back to France. After the fall of fascism, he went back to Bologna to join up with the resistance movement. At the end of the war, he took up once again his role with the Railway Workers' Trade Union. He was elected as a Bologna town councillor in 1951, and in that capacity had the task of running the Polizia Urbana, the municipal police force, or the traffic cops. So anti-fascist experience was probably quite useful there. His efforts were recognized by the city council when they named a park after him in the Cirenaica area, with a caption that describes him as an amministratore pubblico, a public administrator, choosing the soft option to highlight his work as an alderman within local institutions, and thus shying away from his intense and committed anti-fascist activity. The effect was to eclipse the radical nature of his anti-fascism, to flatten out the perception of his political commitment, thus normalizing Giusti and his place in collective memory by pulling what he stood for, and to which he dedicated a large part of his life, onto a more familiar and less threatening terrain. In its hacked version, the caption, Lorenzo Giusti, public administrator, is replaced by Lorenzo Giusti, ferroviere anarchico, anarchist railway worker, which writes a different narrative about him. The vicissitudes of the Giusti case are an illustration of what is at the center of the activities of Resistenze in Cirenaica. That is to say, a reframing of the Italian anti-fascist experience that underscores its intensity and radicality and links it to a decolonization of Italian historiography. Unlike the Bologna city authorities, Resistenze in Cirenaica does not shy away from putting into circulation stories, images, street names, captions that push into the foreground the revolutionary nature of Italian anti-fascism, broadening its scope to include a commitment to decolonization. For Resistenze in Cirenaica, I'm getting there, anti-fascism is decolonization, decolonization is anti-fascism. The new national narrative the group proposes includes both the heroic and exemplary figures of the resistance and anti-fascist struggle, but also, just as importantly, those moments and episodes of Italian history in which agents of the nation committed crimes of various kinds in both the fascist epoch and the liberal one, and they're implicitly criticizing what Eric spoke about a little bit earlier of the picture of Italians as good people. Italiani brava gente, whose fascism was not as bad as German fascism, and whose colonialism was not as bad as British colonialism. Resistenze in Cirenaica's approach flies in the face of a tendency that has become more and more apparent over the last 30 years or so, that of naturalizing and downplaying the colonial experience, and especially fascism, sweetening the bitter pill, treating fascism as an accident of history, or as a regime that did many good things until Hitler came along and ruined it all, or by claiming that fascism and communism were just two sides of the same coin. So opening the door for the return to the center of Italian politics of neo-fascist groups and parties that had been considered political pariahs from the immediate post-World War II years until the 80s. and for the coming to power of Silvio Berlusconi in the mid-1980s and the governing coalition he led that included a neo-fascist party, up to the present and to the result of the Italian elections of last month. Thank you very much. It's a secret.
Yeah.
Is that yours?
That's me, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I'll do it quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Quickly introduce. So, thank you, David. And now we're going to move on to another David. David Featherstone from the University of Glasgow. And the title of his talk is Anti-Fascist Solidarities, Anti-Colonialism, and Contested Usable Pasts. David.
Thanks, Annie.
I'm going to give you 1 minute, and time.
Great. Thanks, everybody. And likewise, just want to echo thanks for everybody that's worked towards this conference. And it's great to be here. On the 1st of May, 1948, Harry O'Connell, who was a black communist seafarer, walked back from Cardiff's May Day demonstration in South Wales, along a street, Bute Street. He would have walked along the street Bute Street, which the great Welsh Marxist historian Gwynalf Williams described as the jugular vein of capitalist South Wales. And he walked along the street with the African-American anthropologist Sinclair Drake. Sinclair Drake was in Cardiff writing his dissertation and hung out with people like O'Connell, who was a seafarer from what was then British Guiana, obviously now Guyana. And O'Connell had become, I think, a key figure in leading the multi-ethnic seafarers community around the south of Cardiff, around Bute Town or Tiger Bay. And they would have been walking back from the centre of Cardiff down to the docks. O'Connell was a key sort of kind of figure in a kind of nascent black left in Cardiff, which has been generally fairly forgotten. And linking to David and Eric's talks, in 1935, O'Connell had been arrested for his role in protests against the invasion of Ethiopia, part of his role in kind of black internationalist struggle. Sinclair Drake, though, in his sort of fieldwork diary, talks about O'Connell's frustration about the 48 May Day. He says that O'Connell had mentioned that it wasn't like back in during the Spanish War, when there would have been a very significant presence of people from the Bay on the march. He said that, and Sinclair Drake notes that there was, in terms of people from the Bay, there was O'Connell and some Somali activists who some of whom would have worked with O'Connell in a communist-led organisation called the Colonial Defence Association. So I just want to kind of mention this at the start, because I think this speaks to an important set of kind of histories of the kind of black and anti-colonial presence in anti-fascism in Britain. It was obviously linked through Sinclair Drake to kind of broader circulations of kind of black internationalism, black kind of intellectual work. But it's the kind of anti-fascist presence that's pretty absent in terms of the ways in which anti-fascism's remembered in the UK. And in this talk, I want to first think a little bit about some of the kind of dynamics around how some of these kind of histories have been perhaps excluded or kind of perhaps downplayed, because we do hear about Paul Robeson, particularly in South Wales, and we also hear about figures like Claudia Jones, but we often hear about Claudia Jones in quite a depoliticised way as the founder of the Notting Hill Carnival, in ways which kind of ignore an abstract that from a kind of broader kind of black internationalist anti-fascism. So, and what I want to do in the talk is think about this in the context of what in Britain and perhaps elsewhere are being referred to as the sort of culture wars, where history is a kind of crucial terrain of struggle, but as we've seen in various contexts. And I want to argue for a particular way of thinking about why it matters to think about these diverse histories of anti-fascism in relationship to the kind of left's challenge to the culture wars. Because often the kind of, certainly in the UK, if you look at the dominant left, it's very kind of supine in relationship to its kind of engagement with these politics. It kind of basically hopes these antagonisms are going to go away. So to kind of think briefly about some of the kind of terms on which anti-fascism has been narrated in quite kind of national terms, I want to turn to kind of Paul Gilroy's work from his classic text on kind of British kind of racism and anti-racism, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. And talking about a pamphlet that was written by the Transport and General Workers Union, which had a preface by Jack Jones, who was actually a kind of veteran of the International Brigades. He talks about how in the pamphlet, written at the kind of a key moment of the kind of rise of the National Front in Britain in the 70s, a kind of fascist movement, this definition of British neo-fascism, he argues, in the way the Transport and General Workers Union had framed anti-fascism, was exclusively shaped in terms of the fascisms of the past against which the British has enjoyed their finest hours in battle, recurs again and again in the politics of anti-racism during the 70s, he argued. Jack Jones's words betray the central tension in the politics of the anti-racist struggle, namely the tendency to conceive of neo-fascism and racism as distinct and unrelated problems, and to make the popular memory of the Second World War the dominant source of images with which to mobilise against the dangers of contemporary racism. And in this sense, it's also a construction of the Second World War which absolutely abstracts it from the kind of colonial and anti-colonial dynamics figured in David's talk and Eric's talk. So in this sense, we have a sense of, and linking back to Matthew's talk earlier, about the sort of instability of the relationships between anti-fascism and anti-racism and anti-colonialism, that we can't take for granted that anti-fascism is necessarily shaped through a kind of and articulated in relationship to a strong commitment to anti-racism in certain moments, and that, as Gilroy argues here, that there was a kind of downplaying of that. And that's not to say that people like Jones weren't doing significant work in this time. And Jones, for example, at this time, as leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, was very kind of influential in shaping that union's opposition to the coup in Chile, and a struggle which, both by British labour activists, also Chilean exiles and others, was itself constructed as an anti-fascist struggle for kind of fairly, I guess, obvious reasons. But how does this relate to the sort of contemporary political moment? Because I think one of the things, in terms of thinking about usable past, I'm going to think about it perhaps a little bit more abstractly than David's very kind of great examples of this. I want to think a little bit about the sort of terrain of debate in terms of the culture wars in the UK and perhaps elsewhere. And as I mentioned at the start of this talk, the kind of history has played a really significant role in the debates. Obviously, the kind of glorious end of Colston in Bristol Harbour was kind of part of that. And I think, in some ways, the culture wars are playing perhaps two roles. Firstly, I think there is a kind of actually a defensive stance from the political right in the UK that in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, the kind of depth of colonial kind of history, its articulations of racism, are becoming much more kind of foregrounded in political debate, and a kind of challenge to kind of white privilege. And these things kind of are kind of, I think, deeply threatening, as they should be to the right. But there's also a way in which, following Stuart Hall, I think these culture wars are being used to bolster, as a key technique through which they are being used to bolster forms of authoritarian populism. And I think this is also, it's important to kind of contextualise British right-wing politics at the moment, where, and I think, like as Stuart Hall argued at the end of the 70s, when the National Front and kind of very much prepared the kind of ground around race, which then Thatcher kind of marched into, there's a kind of very much a kind of closing of the gap between a much more kind of explicitly far-right politics and the kind of far-right politics of the British Conservative Party. They're kind of very much kind of elided at the moment. So you could have the Home Secretary kind of using vicious racist language to describe migrants this week in the most kind of hateful terms. So how, from the left, do we engage with this moment? And I think the rest of this talk, I'm going to think a little bit more about perhaps some of the limitations of left political discourse. I'm going to kind of target the centre-left. It's difficult to really see Keir Starmer as centre-left, but if you kind of bear with me for that at the moment. So, and I want to kind of think a little bit about this in relationship to what role kind of different kinds of histories of anti-fascism might open up in struggling against the kind of very kind of real bolstering of authoritarian tendencies in British politics at the moment. And in this sense, there's a kind of, I think, a challenge for kind of engaged historical work, which I think is neatly captured in this week quote from Sivamohan Vallabhan, where he argues, "The national myth does not reel in defeat when presented with the corrected historical record. Historical myth, after all, is just that, myth. It's not a claim on the past that is indifferent to the present, but instead it's a claim upon the present that merely manipulates the past. The conception of a loss to homogeneity, which is central to a lot of kind of political right discourse, is thus a crucial device in organising forms of contemporary political reflection." So for Vallabhan, the right isn't that interested if we can show actually, as David mentioned, that kind of left politics was much more kind of multi-ethnic, or kind of looking at the forms of important working class multiculturalism that shaped the kind of organising that people like O'Connell were doing. What I want to kind of argue, though, is that in some ways what we need to think about in taking on these kind of these political antagonisms being shaped around historical work is also to really interrogate some of the work that kind of whiteness does in relationship to left versions of history. And I want to kind of briefly think about about three key ways in which whiteness is really kind of limiting the kind of ways in which the left is engaging with the culture wars in various ways, and kind of then to think a little bit about alternatives. So firstly, there's, I think, ways in which both the centre-left and some of the kind of left debates around things like Lexit, the left positions in relationship to the kind of debates around the European Union, have very much refigured at times notions of the white working class and reproduce notions of whiteness as victimhood. And I think this is really problematic in relationship to constructing a kind of more progressive articulation of class and race and gender in contemporary kind of left politics. So we can see often in media and political discourses in the UK, it's actually rare to see the term working class without the term white in front of it. So a very heavily overcoded set of debates around class, which are kind of shaped by a pernicious racism and kind of a pernicious kind of racialized construction of class. Secondly, in relationship to that, I think there's a kind of broader whitening of left politics. Certainly post-Corbyn, Starmer's cleared out most of the people of colour from the kind of front bench of the Labour Party, and has also pushed back against a report called the Ford Report, which demonstrated significant racism within Labour, and he's just kind of tried to kind of push back against that. I think there's, but thirdly, I think there's a kind of set of questions about how this kind of plays out in terms of thinking about the kind of histories of left politics like anti-fascism in the UK. And I think this is important in terms of how we might think about kind of usable pasts in different ways. So I think there's a kind of long-standing, even among the kind of great figures of kind of history from below, people like Thompson, who, like, I admire greatly, E.P. Thompson, but there was a kind of very strong kind of default whiteness in the way that they wrote about kind of working class history. And I think that continues to kind of shape things in certain ways, though there's been a lot of kind of work that obviously has unsettled that. But I think certainly in terms of some popular left histories, that still has kind of quite a lot of kind of, Jesus, 5 minutes, the kind of resonance. The other thing is also, I think, a kind of revisionism of kind of Labour's own history. Starmer wrote a terrible piece in The Guardian, really reclaiming the, arguing that the kind of one of the great achievements of the post-45 Labour governments was the establishment of NATO. And he does that in a way which kind of isolates that from the kind of colonialism, support for colonialism of that government, and the kind of forms of racialized anti-communism, which was central to kind of NATO as well. And I think in this sense, I think it's important to think about what, certainly in a UK and other contexts, opening up a discussion between anti-fascism and anti-colonialism can do in relationship to particular forms of politics. So one area where I think there's a kind of really strong pushback, obviously, against kind of authoritarianism, is in relationship to the important kind of struggles in terms of Black Lives Matter, in terms of kind of pushing back against police violence. And one of the kind of key scholar activists who's been really important in these both making intellectual sense of it, but also being in the movement, is someone like Adam Elliott Cooper. And one of the things that he does in his work is really think about the police as an institution in Britain, which was indelibly shaped by colonialism. And in St. Clair Drake's thesis in Cardiff, one of the things he talks about is one of the reasons people in kind of the Bay Area in Cardiff hated the police was because they brought colonial attitudes to the Bay from their postings in different parts of the British Empire. And if we see these kind of relationships between anti-colonialism and anti-fascism as in terms of opposition to the police, but also in terms of the military, I think this is kind of offers real kind of possibilities for different kind of connections, and also for opening up a long overdue kind of reckoning with the kind of ongoing legacies of kind of British colonialism. But again, this is stuff where both the kind of political right and politicians like Starmer are closing down a kind of political space for this reckoning. So there's been legislation under the current Conservative government that's basically made it impossible for kind of military personnel in places like, who were active in killing civilians in places like the north of Ireland and in Iraq to be tried. And this is kind of 101 authoritarianism, to making that kind of political kind of reckoning off limits, but is absolutely central to these kind of ongoing forms of colonialism. And I think challenging, but also people like Starmer, the kind of Labour Party, aren't contesting these authoritarian kind of edged politics. And I think one of the things that Ada Fried mentioned was the role of the centre-left yesterday in buttressing and not contesting forms of kind of far-right authoritarianism. And I think that's one of the kind of real kind of concerns that I have in terms of this failure to really kind of attack and contest the terms of the kind of culture wars in the UK and other places at the moment from kind of a kind of very moderate left position that wants to see a kind of a liberal response rather than the kind of much more antagonistic politics that I think it can be shaped through kind of engaging with discourses of anti-fascism. So I guess to conclude, I think it's really important to consider the intersection of anti-fascism and anti-colonialism, and that I think this can re-articulate usable past in different ways, as actually David's talk kind of brilliantly showed, that this kind of opens up very different politics, and it also kind of draw attention to kind of the ways in which articulations of opposition to colonialism and racism can be, have been, and should be central to discourses of anti-fascism. And I think one of the kind of important aspects of things like the Black Lives Matter movement is also opening up the kind of resurgence of interest in figures, say, like the Trinidadian radical George Padmore, who articulated a kind of set of ideas around colonial fascism. And I think these kind of histories are really important to be kind of made more central. It signals the importance of diverse articulations of anti-fascist political trajectories, such as those like Carrie O'Connell, in opposition to whitened versions of left political pasts. And I think in opposition to this sort of hegemonic construction of a kind of white working class, it also foregrounds aspects of working class multiculture, which can highlight the ways in which, in some of the different forms through which anti-fascist agency was and can be constituted. Shall we? Yeah.
So, how do we turn this bad boy on? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So my job is to, at this point, thank you both, David and David, for your talks. I love how I know the conference organizers intentionally put topics together, and I now kind of understand why I was asked to moderate this. So, but I will give floor to the questions first. My job is to, if it goes on too long, my unfortunate job is to cut people off a little bit so that we can make room for other questions. So let's just be mindful of our time, but we have about 30 minutes left in this session, so there's plenty of time. So
thank you, and thank you. And my question is for David Featherstone. First of all, when you were speaking about highlighting examples of a cultural agency and a usable past, I don't know about Jack Jones's perception of racism and anti-fascism, but I do just want to give an example of, in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which would have been Jack Jones's counterpart in the United States, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade had a fully integrated military force where you had, for instance, someone like Oliver Law commanding white and black men, and that would have been, well, you can do the math, but the official United States Army was not integrated until July 1948 under Truman. So I just wanted to give that example of a contested usable past.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think actually did some previous work looking at some of the African-American volunteers in the brigades. And I think one of the interesting things is, in terms of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, is how they connect struggles in different parts of the world, but notably the very kind of explicit connection that they drew between fighting fascism in Ethiopia and fighting fascism in Spain. The kind of phrase, there's actually, you'll know it as Alba people, but a really important collection of documents which was called it ain't Ethiopia, but it'll do. So it just that gives that sense of how these kind of political connections were drawn. And I think again, these are the sort of histories that I think we need to kind of make more of on the left, really, in terms of kind of thinking about these sort of diverse connections.
I have a question for the first David. For the first David, if can I ask you? It was very interesting panel. Thank you. Can I ask you if there are other similar experiences, if you know, in Europe or elsewhere in the United States, and what is the real impact in the societies, in the institutions, or in the activists of these kind of experiences? Thank you.
Okay, the Resistenze in Cirenaica in Bologna is not the only group engaged in this kind of activity. There's another group in Palermo, Sicily, which I'm less familiar with, and there are other groups in towns north of Bologna, Reggio Emilia. I'm not sure what's going on outside of Italy, but I'm sure there's plenty of scope for similar kind of actions and activities elsewhere. I believe that on the initial version of the program, Fraser was going to give a talk on the Cesare Balbo thing in Chicago, right? Italo Balbo Square, right? In Chicago, Italo Balbo being a leading fascist who, for some reason or another, is commemorated in Chicago. As to the efficacy, which I think is at the base of your question, Eric, the way I would try and formulate an answer is to think of it as a long-term cultural, anti-fascist cultural battle, right? Preparing the train for the development of an anti-fascist culture which is attentive to colonialism, racism, and everything else. A kind of updating of the anti-fascist legacy that is actually quite necessary in Italy. Anti-fascism has been around for a long time in Italy. Anti-fascists were active there was always anti-fascism in Italy from the early 1920s, even when political opposition was shut down and censorship prevented material being published and circulated in Italy, and up to the armistice of September of 1943, when Italy changed sides in the war. Nazi Germany occupied Italy, and that was the beginning of the armed resistance. That was when young Italian men and women went up into the hills or went into clandestine mode in order to carry out acts of sabotage against the Nazi fascists and against the Italian fascists. And in the immediate post-war years, Italy based its republican version of its history on the example of the resistance movement. The Italian constitution is inspired by anti-fascism. Anti-fascists were revered, partisans were revered in the decades immediately after World War II. But after a while, younger people especially, started getting tired of these commemorations. It was a ritual, and saying the same thing on the April 25th of every year from 1946 to 1966, or whatever it was. So I think there is a need to kind of enliven, reinvigorate the anti-fascist legacy, and I think that's what Resistenze in Cirenaica are trying to do. Inevitably, the conversation, to a large extent, is between the activists of Resistenze in Cirenaica. It's a little bit like preaching to the choir. But if the discourse is, if the questions that they are debating is put into public discourse, then public discourse ultimately circulates. So, and I think it's there that it could have probably its greatest efficacy.
And actually, I'll just come in very quickly on that. After the big wave of Black Lives Matter mobilizations in the summer of 2020 in Glasgow, a lot of the street names in Glasgow are named after kind of colonial kind of generals, merchants who were involved in slavery, and a lot of there was kind of similarly guerrilla kind of street name changes across the city in the centre. So there's a kind of, I guess, different ways in which these strategies are being used.
I want to first thank Dr. Ward for informing me of a new word, autonomy. Is that the study of street names? It's rather
just call it the study of street
okay.
names. And you can forget calling me Doctor.
But your talk reminded me, and actually Eric raised the question. We have examples, I think, throughout Europe. I know in Croatia we have, and it's not street activism, but there are tremendous political arguments about street names. In Zagreb, in Croatia's capital, one of the main squares was called Victims of Fascism Square, which in 1990, after nationalists took over the government, they changed the name to, I think, Square of Croatian Nobles or something like that. But it got renamed back to Victims of Fascism Square. So it's clearly a phenomenon in many countries. And we didn't talk about the United States, which, I mean, that's, I know David Featherstone mentioned cultural wars. I mean, that's a major issue here. Not necessarily street names, but other things. How we name our military installations, including after traitors to the United States. The Confederate flag is seen as a patriotic flag, which is rather odd. So I just wanted to comment. I mean, this is just such a important thing here, although I do, just to put it on a positive spin, I mean, I think it's finally been sort of accepted, say maybe by 60% of the population, I'm guessing, that maybe the Confederate flag is not a good thing, but it's certainly a lightning rod for the Trumpists. I mean, there's no question. So
yeah. Actually, I think in that sense, one of the things that happened, which the Suella Braverman, who I mentioned, this awful kind of conservative politician, like it's difficult to be the most awful conservative politician in the UK at the moment, but she's kind of getting there. But she tried to orchestrate a trial of the Colston Four, who and a jury just wouldn't convict them. So there was a strong. I think there's a lot of kind of obviously right-wing energy in relationship to the culture wars, and perhaps I should have also obviously very clear connections with US kind of forms of kind of political engagement from the right as well. But I think also there's kind of in some key ways like that kind of jury acquittal, kind of a failure to kind of resonate in that sense, and a kind of ways in which those divisions don't necessarily articulate with kind of the sort of multicultural kind of working lives that actually Annie was talking about in terms of Long Island as well. It kind of, so I think there's kind of important kind of resources there as well, but it's also resources that the kind of forms of the UK left just don't really want to talk about as well.
Thanks very much for excellent papers. I had two questions. The first one was to Dave Featherstone. When you kind of include the anti-racism and the anti-colonialism in a serious way in the study of anti-fascism, what kind of consequences has that kind of for our understanding of fascism itself as a phenomenon, right? What are the kind of contributions from the kind of colonial perspectives on fascism, the relations between fascism and European colonialism, for example, which is, I think, a crucial point, and you mentioned Padmore, for example, as one example. The second question kind of already, I wanted to ask Eric in the previous session, how kind of you see, we've discussed in many of the previous talks about the role of the activists for the formation of anti-fascism, but what about the role of scholars and intellectuals in the kind of the formation of a broader anti-fascist culture, and how your scholarship might contribute to that? Thanks. The second one was for both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to kick off?
I'll do this. Yes. The Italian figure who's been referenced over here and there over the last 2 days is Antonio Gramsci, and I think we could do well to take seriously Gramsci's idea of the organic intellectual. The function of the organic intellectual be an intellectual who represents the interests of his or her class, or his or her social group, or in our case it could be or an intellectual who represents the interests of anti-fascism. For Gramsci, everyone is an intellectual, everyone is potentially an intellectual, everyone can be a permanent persuader. Anyone who speaks in public, has an audience, has an effect of being able to influence the people who are listening to him or her. Intellectuals don't have to be people like me who live in ivory towers and claim cultural neutrality. You know, Gramsci saw through that very, very quickly. The claim to neutrality that traditional intellectuals made was really a masquerade for a defense of the status quo. What Gramsci argued for was the creation of a whole class of new intellectuals, as I said, who were able to articulate certain discourses for the benefit of a social group, whether it be the working class or whether it be anti-fascists. As educators, I think part of our job is to produce these organic intellectuals from amongst the students we teach, and this becomes a kind of army, as it were, of people who go out into the world and spread the word. So that's that. For the second part of it, the second part of your question, I think I would go along the Gramscian road from that point of view.
Yeah, and I'd happily continue along the Gramscian road as well. I guess in terms of the question about what thinking about sort of anti-fascism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism in serious dialogue does, I think is really important. And I think, firstly, one way into that is really thinking about foregrounding different theorists and accounts, and also thinking a little bit about really challenging some of the sort of geographies through which fascism and anti-fascism have been envisioned. I guess the classic statement of that is Aimé Césaire's argument that the kind of what was going on in the Second World War was merely, I think is perhaps the wrong word, but was an application of techniques that were kind of commonplace in kind of European colonial contexts back within Europe. So it's kind of really challenging a kind of European-centered notion of fascism and anti-fascism, but also showing that these kind of struggles are in contexts are in an important dialogue. So I think there's that's one aspect of things. Secondly, I think there's opening up also a sense of the kind of contested terrain of which, in terms of which anti-fascism is understood, and I think the Gilroy critique of kind of a British labour movement discourse from the 70s is quite a good example of that, and also again speaks to also that kind of organic intellectual involvement of that. Somebody like Gilroy who was very much involved in anti-racist politics in that time. So I think sometimes it's easy to see. I mean, certainly from kind of an outside perspective, to see anti-fascism as kind of is rather kind of homogenous. But obviously in this conference we've done that's not a kind of that's one of the great things about this conference is the way it's unpacked anti-fascism and stuff in lots of ways. But I think thinking about those things is those contested terrain is important. But also finally perhaps opening up, thinking about different aspects of anti-fascist agency as well. So I think someone like Eva Majewska, or Majewska, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the name, kind of has a kind of an opposition between sort of heroic anti-fascist agency and kind of weak resistance. But I think it's perhaps more interesting to think about different terrains through which anti-fascist agency is shaped. And going back to Harry O'Connell, one of the things he was involved in, which isn't necessarily what you would expect a kind of black left, pretty masculinist seafarer to be doing in the 30s, is writing to the kind of Western Mail, still the kind of key Welsh paper, challenging the pathologisation of mixed race relationships in Cardiff, and that kind of, I think, relates to kind of work by people like Hazel Carby on imperial intimacies, and in the way in which he challenged that kind of pathologization of mixed heritage relationships. He really foregrounds the kind of imperial kind of ways in which kind of politics around sex and relationships are being shaped in that time. So it's a pretty blunt letter, but it's a really interesting way in which he's kind of bringing this kind of politics into contestation. So I think also thinking about the different ways in which thinking about anti-fascism from these different perspectives opens up different terrains of anti-fascist agency is important as well.
This is more of a question and a comment for Welsh David. I mean, I think Paul Gilroy has an argument to make, certainly kind of in response to the British Labour movement and elements of the Anti-Nazi League, and you know, there's a lot of critique of the kind of presentation of anti-fascism as harkening back to the Second World War in a very particular kind of way and celebrating a very particular kind of anti-Nazi resistance to it. But I do think today we're in a different context, and I think the current context, there is much more of a conflation of racism and fascism, and of an understanding of them as almost the same thing, the same phenomena. You know, and this happens in very, you know, in many different kinds of movements where I think, you know, people are kind of, oh, such and such a figure is a racist, therefore they're a Nazi and a fascist, and, you know, so on in popular kind of movements, at least in Australia, against a variety of kind of far-right politicians. That's just common sense, you know, that to call someone a Nazi because they said something racist is kind of completely fine. So, you know, I kind of take your point, but on the other hand, I think we're kind of in a different context, and I think it is, you know, I was wondering if you could kind of say a little bit more about whether, you know, how you kind of understand that current context. The second question, I suppose, was, I know you're doing some research about kind of seafarers in particular, and about the kind of history of this particular section of the working class as being one in which, you know, because of their kind of positionality, because of the kind of travels internationally, because of their, you know, intersection in ports and, you know, places around the world, that has given rise to a particular kind of international solidarities kind of through that, you know, through that union and through that kind of organising. So as just one very small example, in Australia, the very early Indigenous civil rights movements in the 1920s were really influenced by a lot of the seafarers and ship workers who kind of came through some of the major ports in Australia. So there was a sort of a Garveyite movement, which was deeply influenced by, you know, by kind of that sort of global politics. So yeah, it sort of strikes me as there's a lot of rich kind of material there of kind of political intersections and solidarities which can develop through that.
Yeah, I guess maybe to start with that question and then kind of work back to the other question from that. Yeah, I think the kind of politics around seafarers and other maritime workers it can be a really interesting way into thinking to kind of unsettling kind of national articulations of anti-fascism, and to kind of opening up different kind of lenses on what kinds of anti-fascist solidarities meant and happened. And I think the kind of huge solidarities shaped by maritime workers in opposition to the invasion of Ethiopia is kind of which spanned all sorts of different places. Is a really important example of that. And I think one of the things I was thinking about when Eric was talking about is you don't see that kind of that politics necessarily memorialized. I mean, and it's not that I think it should be a kind of static memorials to it, if you know what I mean. But I think those things are really important. And I think likewise the sort of connections between that you mentioned, Vasily, with the Garvey movement. I think there's a lot of really interesting interconnections between, I guess, different South-South movements and connections, which again can really enrich understandings of kind of global left debates around anti-fascism as well, I think, and in important ways. I think, yeah, in terms of Gilroy, I was thinking of that quote more because I think it shows some of the kind of tensions in thinking about usable pasts more generally, rather than thinking about that as something that kind of necessarily speaks to the kind of present political conjuncture. I think there is a kind of question about a kind of which I don't have any easy answers to, about how that kind of routinization of calling people Nazis can almost make kind of fascism and Nazism kind of banal, if you know what I mean. Obviously, it's not, but I think, but so I think there can be issues around that I don't have any easy answers to. But I think it is important to kind of, and also because, say, in contexts like the US and in the UK and elsewhere, the kind of lines between what we might think of as kind of far-right populism and fascism are so kind of close as well. I think that makes, I don't think it makes sense to have strong conceptual kind of divisions between the two in that sense, but there needs to be some sense of the kind of different what's at stake politically in using different kind of terminology is important, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sorry, I just add something. I wholeheartedly agree with your suggestion that we have to be kind of nimble and nuanced in the way that we brand 21st century right-wing, even extreme right-wing political phenomena. You can be racist, anti-Semitic, misogynistic, homophobic, and have no love for democracy, but you can still not be a fascist. That doesn't reduce the danger that you pose to society in general. But I think sometimes we're walking into a big trap when we throw the word fascism around a little bit too liberally. That's what it is.
So I just very quickly I want to say the session is coming to a close very soon, so I think we'll just do these last three individuals, and if you can, no, we will not do three people. We will do one more question. I was going to say if you can make it really quick, but
like a multi-question.
We'll do one more question. Yeah, sorry about that.
Well, this question is going to be directed to Welsh Dave, so I'm going to put him on the spot here. About usable pasts for the British anti-fascist movement. I mean, if you look at the past struggles that are typically invoked by the British anti-fascist movement, we'll find reference to ad nauseum the Battle of Cambridge in 1936, or the Battle of Lewisham in 1977, the Battle of Waterloo train station in 1992. In my own locality, I've been part of where I live in the northeast of England, part of a local campaign to memorialise a Battle of Stockton-on-Tees in 1933, which drove Mosley's fascists out of town. So you see that, and also with reference to Gilroy et al., the use of kind of comfortable pasts in the sense of invoking World War II patriotism against the National Front. That can be effective, a comfortable, it doesn't have to be a difficult past. But, so what I want to do here is, when I said I want to put you on the spot, really, is about how you use decolonialisation struggles as usable pasts. Now, do you see them as playing a national role, as in terms of a national articulation, or would you say they're probably more suited to local articulations? In particular, I'm thinking here, of course, of Cardiff. So that's my question.
Yeah, great question. And I think actually, one thing I was thinking about in terms of Vashti's talk yesterday was how the Australian left knew about Cable Street and stuff. I was thinking about those trajectories, and like I found out about Cable Street through The Men They Couldn't Hang, their great song "Ghosts of Cable Street," and I think that's also really important in terms of those sort of unofficial. Like none of us, well, maybe not none of us, but most of us didn't learn this shit at school, and actually I didn't like it, you kind of. It's those sort of different unofficial knowledges which are really important and also shaped by these sort of the different campaigns and kind of mobilizations of kind of historical knowledge that that Nigel was talking about. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I was actually thinking, were you going to say more international than local? Actually, I think in some ways, I think some of those what could be interesting is also thinking about how a kind of decolonial takes on anti-fascist memorialization could open up connections between different places, rather, I mean, to kind of as a kind of way of constructing solidarities around things, rather than thinking about and tracing out from the kind of connections that different places have, could be a way into kind of opening up the relationships between usable past and solidarity. So I'll kind of but I think it's an interesting question to, and as you say, I mean, I think the politically some of that kind of use of Second World War was politically effective, and we've got to think about what works as well. But we've also got to think about the kind of some of the kind of risks and dangers of particular imaginaries as well.
Marianne, am I allowed to just ask one very quick question? Okay, thank you. David Featherstone, I was actually really interested. It's a question for you, but I think both of you can answer this. I was interested to hear. So I could see why, and it's totally understandable why fascists, conservatives, right-wing, whatever term you want to call that demographic, why anti-fascism, anti-colonialism, anti-racism, all those things are threatening to their very identity and the power they want to hold on to. But why is it so hard for the center-left to get down with it? What is it there that is so threatening?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I mean, I think partly, I mean, it actually goes, like, in some ways, goes back to the that something like that Keir Starmer article is that something like the British Labour Party has never dealt with the kind of depth of colonial articulation of Labour politics in the UK, and I think for a kind of a centre-left politics without a kind of that kind of more explicit reckoning, which I think is beginning to happen, but it's hard for people to get that. I think also the centre-left, maybe this is going to, isn't that imaginative. It doesn't like ideas that much. I mean, in the sense, like, I mean, there's the great Stuart Hall quote that I'm going to kind of boulderize, but which, like, if you kind of think about certainly what's been going on in the UK, like, the centre-left, like, he's got a great essay from one of the kind of Thatcher period essays where he talks about, like, fucking the right of the Labour Party doesn't have any ideas of its own or strategy. It just attacks the left. And he was writing about that in the 80s. But Jesus, if you think about that in terms of what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years in Labour Party, you can just kind of, obviously, we don't want to abuse Stuart Hall by just pulling him pulling quotes out of him and kind of. But it is that kind of, I think there is a lack of political imagination and a lack of ideas, a lack of intellectual engagement. So which, yeah, but there are some good people there who we can dialogue with and kind of hopefully push a bit. But that would be my kind of answer there.
Okay, in the Italian case, the figure of the good, innocent Italian was an invention of the Italian Communist Party. In the immediate post-war years, the Italian Communist Party wanted, in the public's eye at least, did not want to be associated with revolutions or with Moscow. So it pushed a line of itself as a patriotic force whose members had laid down their lives in the interests of the nation, right? And if you adopt that line, a non-threatening communist, as it were, it's hard for you then to go down heavy on the resistance experience as a civil war, for example, in which Italians shot other Italians, anti-fascist Italians killed killed fascist Italians. As a historical fact, that was a part of the resistance experience. Nor can you point the finger of blame at other Italians for all the nasty stuff that went on in the colonies. So I think Italian anti-fascist culture in the long run has paid the price for that Communist Party strategy, right? And the subtext of Resistenze in Cirenaica is a revision of that Communist Party.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Really enjoyed it.